What can you tell us about the overall tone compared to the other Batman games we've seen?
So it's an interesting study in contrasts, because on the one hand, the scenario that we have set up is very heavily linked up with themes and ideas of dark urban folklore, right? You're talking about the Court of Owls as a main adversary. You're talking about a Gotham City where we've tried to expose the history of the city in its very architecture and the very layout and design of the city itself. That implies a kind of darkness, a kind of rain-soaked grittiness that I think most of us have in our heads when we imagine the place. But at the same time, in Batman's absence, now we have a new generation of these four young heroes who obviously know Batman very, very well. They know Gotham City very, very well, but they're bringing really different attitudes to the fight. That difference in attitudes results sometimes in personality conflicts within the group, which we explore in depth, especially in the Belfry when they have their masks off. But also, it's like, what attitude do they bring to the fight? What attitude do they bring to their interactions with, the supporting cast and the major villains and the other major characters? How do they react to learning about the existence of the Court of Owls, right? Batman, their mentor, was someone who lived in conspiracy. He lived in the worst case scenarios. He prepared for everything. So for him, facing off against the Court of Owls becomes this kind of perfect existential face-off, right? For these kids, some of whom are like, I don't need to be prepared, I can joke my way through this. It's a very, very different proposition to suddenly find yourself confronted with a threat like that. So we wanted to make sure that we saw those kinds of contrasts, and that if you were playing as these different heroes, you were going to be experiencing a different interaction as a result.
What was it like bringing the Court of Owls to life? Because since we haven't seen them besides in the comics.
Yeah, I mean, there's obviously a huge potential to that concept, because it is such a compelling idea that you take the thing that has always made Batman, in the position of advantage, which is his just buttoned up knowledge of Gotham City, his absolute awareness, situational awareness of everything that's going on in his city, and then you completely undermine that with an enemy that is effectively invisible or has eluded notice as far as he's concerned. So it's such a compelling idea, but then if you want to bring that to players who are not Batman, none of us are Batman, I'm not a billionaire science ninja, I can't fly a space shuttle. Yeah. Sorry, I shouldn't speak out of turn. Any of you could clearly be, I just know that I am not Batman. But the point being that I think, you're putting players in the shoes of somebody who knows more than they do and has more skill and proficiency and competency at dealing with Gotham-style threats. And so we needed to find ways to turn the court into enemy archetypes that they could fight, and where there would be a range of surprise and a degree of challenge that maybe they don't see with the other enemies that they're fighting in the game. What are the thematic elements of the Court of Owls that can find their way into game systems? Things like resurrection, vulnerability to cold. Some of these things are really mechanical when you get down to it, and some of them are more conceptual. And so that was a big part of the process. It was like unpacking what we knew about the court from the comics and from other media, and then finding the things that had the best possible mapping to the world of the game.
So was there always a hard focus on making sure the traversal, since Gotham's so vertical also, each character has their own distinct way of traversing it, or was there one slice where it was like, it's all the same, they all have the same grappling guns and all that stuff, because they're just using Batman's old gear?
Yeah, I mean, I can tell you all of the how the sausage gets made stories about the game design process, and we went through tons of different permutations about ways that we could approach it. I think we knew from the get-go that everyone was going to be able to grapple, because being able to grapple, being able to quickly kind of manage the verticality of what Gotham City is about is such a core aspect to that fantasy, and that's one area that we didn't need to reinvent the wheel on that. That was something that's well established and well understood. Everybody loves it. It feels good when you can quickly zip up to a rooftop somewhere. But I think beyond that, what we realized was, because we didn't want to create a situation where we have these four heroes who are different from each other at the start, but depending on which one becomes the new knight of Gotham City, they're all going to end up converging into the same kind of semi-Batman. We didn't want this. We really wanted them to remain distinct and actually become more distinct and more different as the player continues to progress. So what that meant was essentially unlocking not just the main ability trees in the RPG sense that we have at the start, but introducing this kind of a fourth ability tree that we call the knighthood tree that is also different for each character and really is like a reflection of what it means to then assume responsibility for the entire city. With that, we said every one of them needs their own style of traversal. That's like step one of knighthood and I mean, as it happens, Batgirl glides. So if you're a fan of the Arkham series, you're going to find that a familiar way of getting around. But we felt like it was really important that we could speak to the philosophical differences of these characters at every turn through the actions, through the verbs essentially that we give the player.
Is everybody's connection with the Court of Owls different in the storyline, especially like Grayson?
So it's a great question, which is, in the context of a comic story or even in an animated movie, there's an opportunity to delve into some of the deep lore and deep connections between the individual heroes and the Court of Owls. What we needed to do was say, how do we tell that story or interpret that story with these four heroes where it doesn't feel like one of them is secretly the actual hero of the story, right? And we actually had that problem in more than one way. It wasn't just Dick Grayson having been at Haley's Circus. It was a bunch of things. And when you look at those four characters, and I don't want to give spoilers, but if you go digging, you can probably imagine it. Each of them kind of had a thing that if we don't manage this well, they become a kind of a disproportionate focus to this game. And we want to make sure that everyone is kind of equally in the same boat, kind of a level playing field for the heroes as they're starting. So that was a fun challenge, but we were able to manage it.
So how did you decide? How do you decide the heroes that you want in the?
So in talking with DC, one of the things we realized is for this particular story, in this particular game, we wanted to go to the earliest days of the Batman family. We wanted to really start with who were the original proteges that worked with him as a crime fighter from the beginning and had the longest history with him, so that we could kind of spread that out in a way that would create some contrast between the characters. It's a really, really hard problem because, to be perfectly honest, there are other characters that have been part of that family as you move closer to the present day who would have given us much greater range, right? It would have allowed us to say, oh, we're going to have a character that's like a character that can fly, and a character like we could have had a much bigger range of difference between them. But it was hard to rationalize that and reconcile it with the need to have the characters that were really his children, like really the closest to him in terms of that common shared history.
What emotions do you want this Gotham City to give the player, especially early on in the game?
It's funny. The question of giving or imposing emotions on players is something I always struggle with this, because I feel like at the end of the day, our job is to deliver a certain kind of aesthetic experience by having the right dynamic to the game. And the right dynamic comes from what is the player doing? How are they interacting with the game world, with the ingredients in it? So I think, to answer your question best, we tried not to say, oh, we want you to feel dread or we want you to be scared all the time, because it's still a game about a heroic fantasy. You need to feel like, I've got this, I've got a shot at it. It might turn out to be bigger and worse than I thought it was, but I will find a way. And so what we always tried to do was make sure that at any given moment, there are tools that the player can use. And there should be a number of valid strategies for taking on any given enemy that you come across, or any given crime that you come across, or any given mystery that you need to solve. So I think, if I had to answer it, the emotion I would say would be one of resourcefulness. It's like, okay, I want the player to be obsessing over how they're going to solve that problem, even when they put the controller down and they're, making a sandwich. And I think that became the kind of underlying emotional tone to the whole thing. It's like curiosity, intrigue, the kinds of things that would drive someone who's a member of the Batman family.
Can you say which elements of the main characters you think, in each case, what the gamer would identify with?
Yeah, I mean, I think Batgirl's ability set and her progression is heavily built around the notion of resilience and tenacity and the ability kind of to doggedly focus on a target or a problem and dismantle it. And so that's how and everything from combat to how she interacts with technology to how she handles traversal is built around that theme. So if you're the kind of player, and I to a certain extent, I would say that Batgirl in some ways most closely resembles the Batman of the Arkham series, if you want to think of it in that respect. Red Hood is, the easy, facile way to put it is that, he's all about the rage and the power and the violence. It isn't just this. It's about harnessing what's inside you. And because his character has gone through death and resurrection, we really love the idea that a whole lot of his potential, a whole lot of the abilities that he would eventually be able to bring to the table once he achieves knighthood would be things that were in there that he didn't know he had. He's lost a chunk of his memory. He's suffering from traumatic brain injury for all intents and purposes, and he's been violently resurrected and had his mind manipulated, and he's come out the other side of that and he's redeemed himself. And so the idea of harnessing abilities and potential that you didn't know you had access to or weren't aware of became a thematic element for him. In the case of Nightwing, it's a no-brainer. He's a leader. And so for him as a potential co-op teammate, it made sense that we would give him more buffs that he could then use to help benefit mechanically the other players that he's playing with. And then finally, in the case of Robin, we love the idea of this is a kid who's relatively new to the crime-fighting game. He might not be the biggest, toughest, scariest individual out there, but he's going to use his brain and his smarts and his resourcefulness to make himself into a scarier force than he actually is. So the idea of Robin transforming himself into this kind of wraith-like piece of urban folklore. He masters invisibility, he masters the Justice League teleporter, he's using various status effects and gizmos that will disrupt and mess with enemies. He's making himself scary because he's not a scary person intrinsically, right? And so yeah, those were the kinds of sort of thematic aspects to each of those heroes that we tried to then manifest in terms of game systems and play.
Sorry to cut in, but that's the time we have.
Okay. Awesome.
Thank you so much.